Nomadic pride.
Hey everybody, today I'm going to show you how I built a low-profile insulated subfloor for the van. I'm using 1-inch insulation board with a value of R6 and 3/4-inch plywood to keep the floor well insulated and under 2 inches thick. For the framework, I'm starting with 8-foot-long 2x2s, which, if you don't know, are actually only 1.5 inches by 1.5 inches. Since my insulation board is 1 inch thick, I'll need to run all those 2x2s over the table saw so that I'm left with pieces that are 1.5 inches by 1 inch thick. After taking measurements, this is the design I came up with for the framework. Now, this is an odd shape, but there's an easy way to think about it that'll make building the framework much easier. Here's the shape of the cargo area. It's basically a big rectangle with a handful of cutouts for the side cargo door, wheel wells, and C-pillars. Now let's think of the floor in terms of simple shapes. If we break it down into 2 large sections and 5 smaller bits, that accounts for almost the entire shape, leaving just a bit in the middle unaccounted for. And I'll deal with that in just a few minutes. But first, let's take out those smaller bits and focus on just the 2 larger sections. These sections will need extra support side to side, and so they'll get east-west oriented cross members. They'll also need shorter north-south oriented supports. And then add on the smaller pieces. This would mean about 99% of the floor framework would be complete. The only thing left would be to connect the 2 sections in the middle. To cover the framework, it'll take 3 sheets of plywood. Here's what the cuts look like. Alright. To get started, I trimmed down all the 2x2s. Then I used the chop saw to cut pieces that would make up the perimeters of the larger 2 sections and their long east-west oriented cross members. After squaring things up and assembling the perimeters of the 2 larger sections, I added the cross members with a screw at either end. Here's a shot of the back section so far. Then back to the chop saw to cut the shorter north-south oriented supports. I determined the proper locations to ensure these pieces all lined up with raised ribs in the cargo space and secured each piece with a screw at either end. After adding all the cross members and supports to the larger sections, I mocked up smaller side pieces with tape just to be sure my measurements were correct. So I brought the pieces back inside and put them together. Here's what I ended up with. And then I screwed these pieces onto the larger sections. With the 2 larger sections fully assembled, I jumped ahead to do some preliminary work with the insulation board. This wasn't completely necessary, but I envisioned it being a lot easier to do this step here in the garage instead of out in the van. Now you'll see that I'm not cutting the panels with a tight fit. Instead, they have about a 1/2 inch gap all the way around. The reason for this will become clear shortly. I labeled each panel for quick placement later and then set them aside. Now back to the framework. While the majority of the north-south oriented supports were sitting on top of ribs in the cargo area, there were a few places that didn't have ribs, such as right here next to the side cargo door. And also underneath the smaller side pieces I'd tacked on. To keep these areas from sagging, I'd need to use shims underneath, so I marked out those locations with red X's as a guide. I then determined that the rib height was 3/8 of an inch, proofed it out real quick, and luckily I had a small piece of 3/8 inch scrap plywood on hand, so I cut it down into 1.5 inch strips. There were a couple places where I'd need some 3/4 inch wide strips, so I ripped one in half while I was at it. Then I flipped the framework sections upside down, cut the shims to length, and glued them all in place and used cinder blocks for weight. After the glue dried, I applied a generous amount of construction adhesive along the surfaces, and then screwed the 2 sections down. Underneath, where the screws penetrated the floor, I applied a double coat of truck bed liner spray to prevent rust. With the 2 sections fastened, it was time to secure the insulation panels in place. Now, bear in mind that the intent isn't to fill every little air gap with spray foam insulation. The spray foam underneath is really just to keep the panels secured firmly in place for what I'm about to do next. As an aside, The weight on top was used to keep the foam from expanding too much, which could potentially raise the panels out of level with the framework. Now, about those gaps around the edges of the insulation board. If I cut the insulation panels exactly to fit, there's a good chance that they would one day end up squeaking as vehicle vibration eventually damaged the edges of the insulation board and the panels started to fit less snugly. By leaving these gaps around the insulation board and then filling the gaps with a flexible spray foam insulation, I'm bonding the wood and the insulation board together while still keeping them separated, and doing so with a spongy material that reduces vibration. As a result, the floor is going to be rock solid and silent for its lifetime. As you might imagine, there was quite a bit of cleanup. The silver facing on the insulation board is a built-in vapor barrier. Typically, you'd just tape the edges of the insulation board, but I had a little problem. The silver surface needs to be intact to work properly. And the thing is, during the cleanup, with the knife especially, I broke that surface in a lot of spots. So rather than taping the seams and then crawling around for hours patching all the many perforations I've made, I decided it would be much faster to just tape the entire surface in long runs to ensure full coverage without having to inspect every last inch of the floor. Luckily, this only added about $15 to the cost, and the weight was negligible. With the framework fully secured, insulated, and taped, it was time to get the plywood in place. I've never templated out something like this, so my brother did the first one to give me a crash course in how to transfer an odd pattern onto a piece of cardboard. Since the middle board would be the most difficult, he did that one to get it knocked out, leaving the two easier ones for me to do later. He just kind of rocks like that. So he did an awesome job on that one, and with my newfound knowledge, I got started on the other two the next day. The first one was pretty easy with just a couple cuts needed. With the fit just right, I transferred marks onto the plywood to indicate where all the supports were located underneath, and then made pilot holes so I could basically just place the board and get it screwed down quickly without having to think much about what was underneath. It worked well, and the board was secured in no time. The last board needed a few more cuts than the previous one, but it was still pretty straightforward. Here, I'm marking out the wheel wells for the passenger side. After a few minutes, I was making the cuts, drilling the pilot holes, and getting the board set in place. And then screwing it all down. So at this point, the entire surface was now covered with the 3/4 inch ply. But knowing that it might possibly be a couple weeks before I got to the actual floor covering installation, I decided to sand the surface, mostly to prevent splinters if I happened to be in there barefooted or in socks. After sanding it down and blowing out the dust, I laid down a double coat of mold and mildew resistant paint, and with that, the subfloor was complete. If you made it here to the end, I'm extremely grateful. If you would, please do drop a clover emoji in the comments so that I know that you made it and that you actually do support what I'm doing. I appreciate your allowing me to be a part of your day, and I'll see you in the next one.